The light was the color of old gold and cheap whiskey, bleeding out across the single artery of the town they called Redemption. It was a liar's name for a place that offered none. The light pooled in the dust, turning it to a fine, shimmering powder that coated everything, a second skin of grit and failure. It settled on the warped boards of the general store porch, on the sleeping dog twitching in a dream of rabbit chasing, and on the unblinking windows that looked out like dead eyes. This was the light that Mara Ellison hobbled into, and it offered neither warmth nor welcome. Her hair, once the color of harvested wheat, was a matted nest caked with the gray dust of the trail. It clung to the sweat on her temples and the back of her neck, a gritty torment that had ceased to be a nuisance and was now simply a part of her. A fresh split, angry and purpled, marred the fullness of her bottom lip, a testament to a fall, or perhaps something worse. Her two crutches were not proper crutches, but stout branches, stripped of their bark and smoothed by desperate hands. The tops were wrapped in rags, but the rags were thin now, and the raw, splintered wood bit into the hollows of her armpits with every agonizing step. They made a sound on the boardwalk, a dry, rhythmic thud and scrape, a sound that announced her poverty and her pain to the whole town. Whispers followed her like flies to a wound. They started low, a rustle from behind a lace curtain in the assayer's office, a murmur between two women shelling peas on a shaded porch. Then they grew bolder, carried on the hot, still air. "Beggar," one man said, not bothering to lower his voice as he spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed perilously close to the hem of her frayed dress. The brown stain blossomed in the dust. "Widow," a woman's voice, sharp and self-righteous, cut from the shadows of the mercantile. The word was an accusation, as if the state of her husbandlessness were a moral failing, a contagion to be shunned. "Cursed," another voice added, and this one was filled with the grim satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled. The town had decided her story long before she had arrived to live it. No one used her name. Mara Ellison had been scrubbed away by misfortune, erased by the town's collective and convenient memory. She was a collection of labels, a cautionary tale walking on two broken sticks. The town spoke in the shorthand of gossip, in half-truths shouted at full volume, and their judgment was as heavy and hot as the late afternoon sun. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the treacherous path of the boardwalk, on the protruding nails and splintered planks that threatened to betray her with every step. To look up would be to meet their eyes, to see the pity that was worse than scorn, the curiosity that was a violation. Shame was a physical thing, a hot stone in her belly. Leaning against the rail of the saloon porch, a man stood as if he'd been carved from the same unyielding timber as the building itself. His name was Coulter Wade. His jaw was a hard line, set against the world, and the skin across his cheekbones was pulled taut, weathered by a sun and wind that had stripped away anything soft long ago. Scars, older and paler than the sun-darkened skin around them, told stories he never would. A faint white line that bisected his left eyebrow, a deeper, ragged crescent just below his jaw that disappeared into the collar of his shirt. He had a quiet temper, the kind that didn't explode but simmered, a dangerous heat you could feel just by standing too close. He held a half-empty glass, but he wasn't drinking from it. He was just watching. His eyes, shielded beneath the sweat and storm-stained brim of his hat, were unreadable. They took in the scene, the dying light, the whispering town, the woman on splintered crutches with a stillness that gave nothing away. He saw the dust motes dancing in the golden air, and the way Mara's knuckles were white where she gripped her supports. He saw the spit land near her worn boots. Mara paused, her breath a shallow catch in her throat. The sun was relentless, beating down on her head, and a wave of dizziness threatened to pull her under. All she wanted was a moment of reprieve, a small square of shadow to gather what was left of her strength. Her gaze found the sliver of shade cast by the saloon's overhang. She directed her words to the boots of the men assembled there, unable to lift her head any higher. Her voice was half air, a dry rasp. "Please, sir, just a moment in the shade." A low chuckle answered her. It came from the man who had spat, a portly fellow with a red, bloated face and suspenders straining against the swell of his belly. He shifted his weight, blocking the patch of shade more completely. "Shades for paying customers," he slurred, a grin revealing stained teeth, "or for folks who ain't an offense to the eyes." Mara flinched as if struck. The insult landed, sharp and bruising. She took a half-step back, a retreat she couldn't afford. It was then that the crutch slipped. The splintered base found a patch of loose dust on a smooth board, and it shot out from under her arm. A small cry, one of surprise and resignation, escaped her lips. The world tilted violently. She crashed down, not all at once, but in a clumsy, painful sequence. Her left knee, the one that had borne the brunt of her weight for so long, took the full impact. The fabric of her dress tore, and the skin beneath it, thin and scarred and never fully healed, broke open yet again. A fresh welling of blood, dark and immediate, stained the cloth and the dusty wood. She remained there, on one knee, the world a blur of pain and humiliation, the laughter of the drunk ringing in her ears. The world seemed to hold its breath. The whispers stopped, replaced by a more intense, more focused silence of spectacle, and on the saloon porch, Coulter Wade moved. He didn't push past anyone. He didn't say a word to the drunkard. He simply straightened up from the rail, placing his glass down with a quiet, deliberate click. His jaw muscle ticked, a tiny, furious spasm in the otherwise still landscape of his face. He stepped down from the porch, his boots making a solid, definitive sound on the street-level boards. He stopped in front of her. He looked down at the top of her bowed, dusty head. His voice, when it came, was flat, devoid of pity or kindness. It was a command forged in impatience, as if mercy were just another chore he had to get through. "Up," he said. Mara didn't respond. She couldn't. The pain in her knee was a white-hot scream, and the shame was a tide pulling her down, wanting to drown her right there in the dust of Main Street. Her hands trembled as she tried to reposition her remaining crutch to push herself up. A futile effort. He didn't wait. With a sigh that sounded more like an oath, he crouched, one arm, hard as iron, went around her back, the other slipped beneath her knees. He lifted her as if she were a child, or a sack of feed that had fallen from a wagon. The shock of it jolted through her. He was all coiled strength and rough fabric and the faint, clean scent of soap and leather. She weighed nothing to him. She weighed less than hunger, less than the memory of a long drought. For a terrifying, disorienting moment, she was airborne, held fast against a chest as solid as a stone wall. He set her on her feet, holding her steady by the elbow until she had her one good crutch balanced again. He then bent, retrieved the fallen branch, and pushed it back into her hand without a word. The porch crowd, their entertainment concluded, began to mutter amongst themselves. "He'll regret that," one voice declared. "She's got the mark of bad luck on her." "Wade's always been a fool for a stray dog or a broken thing," another added, shaking his head with a sage and knowing air. Coulter heard them. He didn't turn his head. He didn't acknowledge their existence with so much as a glance. Instead, he angled his body, a subtle shift of his broad shoulders that placed him squarely between Mara and the chorus of voices. He became her shield, a wall of silent defiance. He absorbed their words, their stares, their judgment, and they fell away from him like water off oiled canvas. He started walking. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just went, his stride long and even, heading away from the heart of the town, towards the open, empty land that stretched beyond it. Mara hesitated for only a second. There was nowhere else to go. With a surge of will that drew on the last of her reserves, she followed. Her crutches began their somber rhythm again. A click-scrape, click-scrape, falling into a strange harmony with the steady, relentless thud of his boots on the dusty road. Click, thud, Scrape, thud. They were a procession of two, leaving redemption behind. The last of the town's buildings fell away, and the prairie opened up before them like a vast, unhealed scar on the face of the earth. It was silent, save for the whisper of a hot wind that stirred the dust around their feet. The land was sunburned, bleached to shades of pale yellow and brown, the grasses brittle and thirsty. Far above, a lone hawk circled in the immense, empty blue of the sky, a patient predator watching over a kingdom of dust and distance. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, no promises. It was as stark and unforgiving as the lives of the people who dared to scratch a living from it. And off in that distance, a shape began to resolve itself out of the shimmering heat, a lean ranch, looking as if it were holding onto the earth by sheer force of will. A single, low-slung house, a barn that listed slightly to one side, and a web of corrals. A section of the fence was broken, the rails askew like crooked teeth. A stone well stood near the house, its bucket pulled up, a clear sign that it was dry. This was his home. It was not a sanctuary. It was shelter, but the kind of shelter that looked like it kept its secrets locked up tight. A place that had learned the hard lesson that survival was a private, solitary affair. It was where he was taking her. And for the first time in a long time, Mara Ellison didn't know if she was running from something terrible or toward it. All she knew was the click of her crutches and the sound of his boots leading her on into the vast, scarred silence. The walk from the town had been a silent ordeal, a journey measured in dust and pain. Now, the barn's interior was a world of cool, structured dimness. The air was thick with the ghosts of 100 summers, the sweet, dry scent of old hay, the sharp tang of horsehide and leather, and the earthy smell of the packed dirt floor. Shafts of the dying sun pierced through the gaps in the warped wallboards, creating solid-looking bars of golden light that were alive with dancing dust motes. It was quiet, a deep and profound quiet that swallowed the sounds of the outside world. Coulter Wade did not lead her to a corner. He led her to the center of this quiet world, to a stall that was empty save for a generous pile of clean, bright hay. It wasn't the loose, trampled stuff on the floor. This was fresh from the loft, still fragrant with the memory of sunshine and open fields. He didn't look at her. He gestured toward it with a jerk of his chin, his expression unreadable, his body language stiff. "One night," he said. The words were not unkind, but they were as hard and definite as two stones dropped into a well. They were the beginning and the end of the contract. He was offering shelter. Not a home. He was providing a reprieve, not a rescue. The kindness was there, in the clean hay and the solid roof, but it was hedged with a clear and unassailable boundary. Don't get comfortable. Don't expect more. One night. Before Mara could find her voice to thank him, a sound broke the stillness, a heavy, metallic thump as he set a wooden bucket down on the packed earth. Water sloshed over the rim, darkening the dust. "Wash," he commanded, his voice as flat as before. Then his eyes flickered to the far stall, where a large gray mare shifted her weight, her ears twitching. "Don't touch the gray mare. She kicks." Another rule, another boundary. This one for her safety, but delivered with the same gruff economy of words. He was a man who built fences, both with wood and with language. And then he was gone. He turned and walked out, the large barn door groaning softly behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, echoing silence. For a long moment, Mara simply stood there, leaning heavily on her crutches, her body trembling with a bone-deep exhaustion that was more than just physical. The quiet of the barn was a balm, a stark contrast to the loud whispers of the town. Here, there were no judging eyes, no voices to name her failures. There was only the smell of hay, the patient presence of the horses, and the cool water in the bucket at her feet. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself to the ground, her injured knee screaming a protest that she silenced with a clench of her jaw. She propped her back against a sturdy post and sat, just breathing. The simple act of inhaling air that didn't feel thick with contempt was a luxury. After a time, she reached for the bucket, dragging it closer. The water was cool, drawn from a deeper well somewhere, a well that hadn't yet given up. With clumsy, trembling fingers, she unfastened her worn boots. They were cracked and thin-soled, offering little protection from the harshness of the land. Peeling off her stockings was a slow, painful process. The cheap fabric had stuck to the raw, weeping wound on her knee and to the smaller cuts and blisters on her feet. She tore them away with a sharp intake of breath, gritting her teeth against the fresh sting. She dipped the corner of her ragged dress hem into the bucket. The water was a shock, cold and clean. Methodically, she began to wash. She cleaned the new wound on her knee first, rinsing away the blood and the grit that had been ground into it when she fell. The water stung, but it was a clean pain, a purifying one. She washed her feet, her ankles, her calves, watching as the layers of trail dust dissolved, revealing the pale, bruised skin beneath. She saw a map of her journey in the geography of her own flesh, the angry red lines where the tops of her boots had chafed her, the purple and yellow continents of old bruises, the thin white scars that were souvenirs from a life before this one. When she was done, she leaned over the bucket to rinse the cloth, and in the still, dark water, she saw her reflection. The face that looked back at her was a stranger's. It was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp and prominent beneath a layer of grime. Her eyes were wide and haunted, set in deep, shadowy hollows. Her split lip was swollen, a dark slash in the pale mask of her face. But as she stared, something else emerged from behind the mask of the victim. She saw the stubborn set of the jaw. She saw the flicker of defiance in the eyes that had refused to weep in front of the town. She saw the resilience in the lines around her mouth. She was broken. Yes, but she was not shattered. The face in the water startled her, not because of its wretchedness, but because it had survived. She had survived more than she had ever expected to. She had woken up this morning with nothing, and she was still here, with a roof over her head and clean water to wash her wounds. It was a victory so small it was almost invisible, but it was a victory nonetheless. A sound from outside pulled her from her reverie. It was a steady, metallic rhythm. Clang, scrape, clang. It was the sound of a file on steel, a workman's hymn. Coulter Wade was out there, mending a tool or sharpening a blade, filling the encroaching twilight with the sound of labor. It was the sound of a man who preferred the company of inanimate objects, of problems that could be solved with muscle and focus. It was the sound of a man not thinking too much, of a man keeping his own ghosts at bay with the simple, honest rhythm of work. The sound was strangely comforting. It was a sign of life, of order, of a world that continued to turn and function despite her own personal chaos. It anchored her to this place, this moment. Dusk deepened, bleeding purple and gray into the gold. The world outside the barn was softening, its sharp edges blurring into shadow. The rhythmic clang of the file stopped. Silence descended again, thicker this time, filled with the anticipation of night. The barn door creaked open, a long, low complaint of wood on iron. Coulter stood silhouetted against the fading light. He was a tall, dark shape, his features obscured. In one hand, he held a folded blanket. In the other, a lantern, its glass clean, its wick trimmed. A small, steady flame burned within it, a captured star against the gloom. He stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He didn't come all the way to her, stopping a few feet away, maintaining that careful distance. He held out the blanket. It was gray wool, thick and heavy, and it looked clean. "Gets cold," he said. The same flat tone, the same refusal to soften the words. It was a statement of fact, not an expression of concern, but the blanket itself was the concern. The blanket was the kindness he couldn't or wouldn't voice. Mara reached out and took it. her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. His hand was calloused and warm. The brief contact was like a spark, a surprising jolt of simple human connection. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He grunted in response, a sound that was neither assent nor dismissal. His gaze dropped from her face to her legs, to the freshly cleaned wounds and the landscape of old bruises. He looked at them not with pity, but with a strange, careful intensity, the way a man might read the inscription on a grave, trying to piece together a story from the scant evidence left behind. The silence stretched, and for a moment, Mara felt exposed, as if his eyes could see right through her skin to the pain beneath. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher, as if the words were being dragged up from somewhere deep. He wasn't looking at her anymore, but past her, into the deepening shadows of the barn. "Had a brother once?" he muttered, the words clipped and reluctant. "Fell on hard times. No one helped." He stopped, his jaw tightening as if to bite off the rest of the sentence. "That was the last time I figured Mercy had a place out here." He wasn't talking to her, not really. He was talking to a ghost, to a memory that the sight of her had stirred from its slumber. He was explaining himself to himself, justifying this uncharacteristic act of charity, this deviation from a hard-learned lesson. He had seen what happens when mercy is absent, and though he might resent the feeling, he could not, in the end, turn his back completely. He was giving her what his brother had been denied. He set the lantern down on a crate near the stall entrance. Its light pushed back the shadows, creating a small, warm circle of safety in the vast darkness of the barn. Then he turned and left, pulling the heavy door almost closed behind him, leaving just a crack. He didn't go into the house. Mara could see his silhouette as he walked over to the porch. He sat down on the top step, his back to her, a solid, unmoving sentinel. And the lantern stayed where it was, burning on the porch. It threw its steady, golden light across the yard, a beacon. It was a proof of presence. It was his way of saying he was there, listening for her breath, listening for any sound of distress. He was standing watch. The night sounds began to tune themselves up. The frantic, sawing chorus of crickets, the lonely hoot of an owl from a distant cottonwood, the soft rustle of the wind as it slipped through the rafters of the barn, whispering secrets to the hay. The sounds settled over the world like stitches across a tear, slowly, carefully, pulling the edges of the broken day together. Mara unfolded the heavy wool blanket. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean air. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the warmth seeping into her chilled bones. She lay back in the clean, fragrant hay, the lantern on the porch a comforting glow in the corner of her eye. Safe. For one night, she was safe. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slipped from the corner of her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her temple. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a profound and overwhelming relief that was almost painful. She whispered the words to the darkness, to the listening quiet of the barn. Even pity feels like heaven. Outside on the porch, Coulter Wade sat with his arms resting on his knees, his hat pulled low. He stared out into the immense, dark prairie, a landscape that could swallow a person whole. He sat there for a long, long time, a silent guardian, as if daring the dark to try and take her again. She woke to a world painted in soft gold. Morning light, thick and syrupy, dripped through the warped boards of the barn wall, striping the hay and the dusty air with warmth. Across the yard, on the porch railing, the lantern still burned. Its flame was a pale, low thing, almost invisible against the brightness of the new day, but it was alive. It had stood its watch through the night, a small, stubborn testament to the man who had lit it. The sight of it sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth through her chest, a feeling so foreign she couldn't immediately name it as gratitude. Sleep had been a shallow, broken thing, but it had been sleep, real sleep, under a roof, wrapped in a thick blanket, without the fear of what the darkness might hold. Her body was a symphony of aches, the deep throb in her knee now a constant, dull companion. But the edge of her exhaustion had been blunted. She sat up slowly, the clean hay rustling around her, the blanket pooling in her lap. A sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the morning quiet. Hammer blows, hard, efficient, and precise. 1, 2, 3. A pause. Then again, Coulter Wade was already at work. She pictured him out there, his back to the rising sun, mending the broken fence she'd noticed yesterday. His movements economical and sure. He was a man who met the day with labor, who spoke to the world through the language of hammer and nail. The sound was a spur. It called to the part of her that had been dormant for so long, the part that knew the value of a day's work, the part that understood that survival was earned, not given. The thought of staying here, a useless burden in his barn, was intolerable. Pity was a poison, and she had been forced to drink it for too long. His gruff, hedged kindness of the night before had been a life-saving antidote, but she could not live on it. Pushing herself up was a clumsy, painful effort. She used the wall for support, her good leg trembling with the strain, her bad knee sending shards of fire up her thigh. For a moment, the barn tilted, and she pressed her forehead against the rough wood, breathing through the pain until the world righted itself. She found her splintered crutches, the feel of the rough wood under her arms now grimly familiar. She had to do something, anything. She hobbled to the barn door and peered out. He was exactly where she had pictured him, at the far end of the corral. His back to her, a new rail, pale and freshly cut, lay on the ground. He was hammering the old, broken one free from its post. He moved with a coiled energy, a strength that was contained and focused entirely on the task at hand. He seemed a part of the landscape, as weathered and unyielding as the sun-bleached posts of the fence. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she stepped out into the yard. The morning air was already growing warm, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. He didn't hear her approach over the sound of his own work. She stopped a respectful distance away, waiting. He finally wrenched the broken rail free, tossing it aside with a grunt of satisfaction. He turned to pick up the new one and saw her. He froze, his hand hovering over the fresh timber. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she saw his jaw tighten. He looked at her as if she were a complication he had not yet decided how to solve. Her own voice was thin, but she forced it to be steady. "Mr. Wade." He gave a curt nod, his eyes flicking from her face to her crutches and back again. "Ma'am." I need to do something," she said, the words coming out in a rush. I can't just sit and breathe someone else's air. I can clean, or cook, something to earn the space I took." His expression didn't change. He straightened up slowly, his silence a heavy thing. She thought for a moment he would simply say no, would tell her to go back to the barn and wait. He was a man who seemed to have his life arranged just so, a fortress of solitude and routine, and she was an intruder, a disruption to the established order. "House is unlocked," he said finally, his voice rough. Then he turned his back on her, picked up the new rail, and set it into place. His attention already returned to the fence. The conversation was over. It was a dismissal, but it was also a permission, clinging to that small, unspoken consent. Mara made her way toward the house. The front door was a simple plank construction with a leather pull string. It opened with a low groan onto a single, large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. The room was a portrait of a life lived without softness. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean, but the mantelpiece above it empty, save for a box of matches. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden table, its surface a geography of scars, knife cuts, dark rings from hot pans, a long, deep gouge that spoke of a moment of anger or carelessness. Two mismatched chairs were tucked beneath it. Against the far wall was a dry sink with a bucket of water and a single tin basin. A cast-iron stove stood cold in the corner, and a few shelves held the sum of the house's inventory: a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a canister of salt. There was one plate, thick and white, with a chip on the rim, one fork, one knife, one tin cup. And on a small, unsteady-looking nightstand next to a narrow cot, there was a Bible. It was bound in dark, cracked leather. The corners softened and rounded with use. It lay open, and as Mara drew closer, she saw that the pages it was open to were thin, almost transparent, the paper worn down by the repeated touch of a searching thumb. It was the book of Isaiah, a book of judgment and desolation, but also of comfort and improbable hope. The state of the room was not one of filth, but of profound neglect. A thick layer of dust coated everything, softening the sharp edges of the furniture. The floor, made of wide pine planks, was gray with a film of grime and tracked-in mud. It was a room that was used, not lived in, a place for sleeping and eating, not for resting. She found a broom leaning in a corner, its bristles worn and uneven, and she began to sweep. At first, her movements were awkward. She had to lean heavily on one crutch, using her free arm to work the broom in short, inefficient strokes. Her bad leg began to shake with the effort, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. But she did not stop. A purpose had taken root in her, and it was a more powerful force than the pain. With every sweep of the broom, she was not just cleaning his house. She was scrubbing away a small piece of her own shame. She was asserting her existence, her ability to make a mark, to create a small patch of order in a world of chaos. Slowly, the floor began to reveal itself. The pale, honey-colored wood emerged from beneath the gray grime, its grain beautiful and clear. She worked her way across the room, her movements finding a rhythm. The dust rose in clouds, catching in the sunbeams that streamed through the single dirty window. She could feel sweat trickling down her temples, but she welcomed it. It was the sweat of honest effort, a feeling she had almost forgotten. The tremor in her leg became a steady, burning ache, but her resolve steadied her. She was just finishing, pushing the last pile of dirt and dust toward the hearth, when the door creaked open behind her. Coulter entered, bringing the bright smell of sunshine and sawdust with him. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. His boots were muddy, and he stopped just inside the threshold, as if hesitant to mar the newly cleaned floor. He looked from the pale, clean wood to the broom in her hand, and then to her face. "Didn't ask you to," he said. His voice was not angry, but it was guarded, a wall put up against an unknown emotion. Mara leaned on the broom handle, catching her breath. She met his shadowed gaze directly, a spark of defiance kindling within her. "You didn't ask me to breathe either," she replied, her own voice quiet but firm. Silence. The dust motes continued their silent dance in the sunbeams. She saw something shift in the set of his jaw. The corner of his mouth twitched, a tiny, involuntary movement that was almost a smile, but not quite. It was the expression of a man who had been caught off guard, who had heard an unexpected truth and didn't know what to do with it. It was as if a smile had tried to get free, and he hated that it had almost succeeded. He looked away, breaking the intensity of the moment, and crossed to the dry sink to wash his hands. The truce, if it could be called that, was unspoken. She had tested an edge, and he had not pushed her back. The sun climbed higher, and the morning gave way to the heat of midday. Hunger, a familiar ache, began to gnaw at her. She looked at the stove, at the meager supplies on the shelf. It was a test, another one. Not of her will this time, but of her skill. She could do this. Building a fire in the stove, working the pump to get more water, finding the skillet and the coffee pot, it was all a slow, careful exploration. She moved around the small kitchen space with a growing sense of purpose. The food itself was a challenge. The flour was coarse. The eggs were from a basket in a cool box outside, and she wasn't sure how fresh they were. The potatoes had begun to sprout soft, pale eyes. It was the fare of a man who ate to live, not for pleasure. She made coffee first, boiling it on the stove. But she let it go too long, and the smell was bitter and scorched. The eggs hissed in the skillet, and she was so afraid of undercooking them that she let the edges turn brown and crispy. The potatoes she fried with a bit of lard, but she was hesitant with the salt, afraid of ruining the only food they had. The result was a meal born of anxiety and good intentions. A plate of scorched eggs, pale potatoes, and a cup of coffee that smelled like punishment. She set the single chipped plate on the scarred table just as he came back inside. He moved without a word, pulling out one of the chairs and sitting down. He looked at the plate, his face giving nothing away. Mara stood by the stove, her hands twisted in the fabric of her dress, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt like a girl on her first day of service, awaiting the judgment of a stern master. He picked up the fork and began to eat. He ate like a man measuring truth. He took a bite of the eggs, his jaw working slowly. He tried the potatoes. He took a long swallow of the overboiled coffee and didn't even flinch. He ate everything on the plate, methodically, silently, cleaning it with a piece of bread she had managed not to burn. The only sounds in the room were the scrape of his fork against the cheap ceramic and the frantic beating of her own heart. When he was finished, he pushed the plate away and leaned back in his chair, finally looking at her. The silence stretched, and Mara braced herself for the verdict. "Could use salt," he said, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Yes, I'll do better next time." The words came out before she could stop them, an implicit assumption that there would be a next time, an admission of a hope she hadn't dared to acknowledge. He considered her for a long moment, his eyes still unreadable. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Ain't bad, though." And with those 3 words, something deep inside her, a knot of shame and worthlessness that had been tightening for months, began to unspool. It wasn't praise. It was far from it. But it was an acceptance. It was a recognition of her effort. It was a man who lived on the sharp edges of truth, telling her that she had not completely failed. In the sparse, unforgiving vocabulary of his world, "ain't bad" was a form of grace, dignity, which she thought had abandoned her forever on a dusty road, had just walked back in through the door and taken a seat at the table. She turned away, busying herself at the sink, so he would not see the sudden film of tears in her eyes. Outside, the sky had begun to change. The brilliant, empty blue of the morning was being slowly consumed by a bank of darker clouds building on the western horizon. They were stacking up, layer upon layer of bruised purple and gray, silent and immense. A low, distant rumble, more a feeling in the chest than a sound, vibrated through the floorboards. Thunder. It was coming. It felt like a promise no one had asked for, a reminder that the small, fragile peace she had found in this kitchen was at the mercy of a much larger and much more violent world. The thunder did not arrive like a guest. It came like a thief, stealing the quiet peace of the afternoon. It had started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration. A tremor felt more in the bones than in the ears. But now, it was a presence. The brilliant blue sky had been swallowed from the west by a bruised and churning mass of clouds, and the light in the small house had turned a sickly yellow-gray, the color of old bruises. A heavy, waiting silence fell over the prairie, the kind of silence that precedes violence. The air grew thick, electric, tasting of dust and ozone. Mara was standing by the table, running a damp cloth over its scarred surface. When the first flash came, it wasn't a flicker, it was a schism. The world outside the window went white, a brutal, silent violence that bleached all color from the landscape for one searing heartbeat. She flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk of her entire body, the rag falling from her hand. And then the thunder answered. It was not a rumble, it was a crack, a physical blow that shook the very foundations of the small house. The single window pane rattled in its frame, a sound like chattering teeth, The noise was absolute, a solid wall of sound that slammed into her. It was the sound of a giant tree splitting down its core, of a rock slide in a narrow canyon. To Mara, it was the sound of a door being kicked in. It was the roar of a violent man. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, illuminated the room in a stark, momentary glare. It was followed almost instantly by a deafening explosion of sound that felt as if it were right on top of the roof. A choked cry was torn from her throat. She didn't think. Her body remembered a terror her mind tried to forget. She scrambled, her bad leg dragging, her crutches abandoned, and crouched low by the stone hearth. It was the most solid thing in the room, a bastion of rock and mortar. She pressed herself against the cool stones, wrapping her arms around her head, her hands clamped tight over her ears as if she could physically block out the assault. She curled into a small, tight ball, trying to make herself disappear. The storm was a monster, and it was speaking in a language she knew too well. Every clap of thunder was a fist slamming on a table. Every gust of wind that shrieked around the corners of the house was a shouted curse. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the lightning still burned through her eyelids, searing white-hot images against the darkness. The smell of the rain as it began to fall, a frantic, hard-pounding downpour, was the smell of blood and sweat in a closed room. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She was no longer in Coulter Wade's house. She was somewhere else, a place of shadow and fear, reliving a terror that had left its brand on her soul. The front door burst open with a crash, shoved by a gust of wind that sent a spray of cold rain skittering across the clean floor. Coulter Wade stood on the threshold, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous gray world outside. He was soaked through, his hat dripping, his shirt plastered to the hard planes of his shoulders and back. He had been caught out securing the animals, ensuring the gate to the corral was latched tight against the storm's panic. He slammed the door shut, the heavy wooden bar falling into place with a solid thud that cut off the scream of the wind. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, water dripping from him onto the floorboards. Then he saw her, a small, trembling heap by the hearth, trying to fold herself into the stone. He saw her hands pressed over her ears, her shoulders shaking with each new peal of thunder. There was no softness in his face. His expression was grim, his jaw set. He had seen fear like this before, the kind that wasn't just about loud noises and flashing lights. It was an older, deeper fear. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his wet boots leaving dark prints on the pale wood. He knelt beside her. He did not kneel with softness or pity. He knelt with the solid, grounding weight of a boulder, an immovable object in her swirling world of chaos. He did not touch her, not at first. He simply placed himself near her, a solid presence in the storm-tossed room. "Storm will pass," he said. His voice was a fence post. It was plain, unadorned, and sunk deep into the earth. It wasn't meant to soothe. It was meant to hold. It was a statement of irrefutable fact, a truth to cling to when everything else was noise and terror. She didn't seem to hear him. A particularly violent clap of thunder shook the house, and a fresh wave of tremors ran through her body. He reached for the shawl that lay folded on one of the chairs, the one she had used as a pillow in the barn. It was a poor, thin thing, but it was hers. He unfolded it and gently, with a surprising lack of clumsiness for a man with such hard hands, he wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. The gesture was simple, practical, an offering of warmth against a sudden chill. As he did, his gaze fell upon her feet, tucked beneath her dress. They were bare, and they told a story of their own. They were bruised, the skin mapped with a fine web of pale scars that crisscrossed her ankles and the tops of her arches. He saw the calluses, the broken blisters, the raw, chafed skin. These were the feet of a woman who had walked a long, hard road, who had kept going when every instinct must have screamed for her to stop. They were brave feet. He looked from her feet back to the top of her bowed head. "You walk like every step costs a prayer," he said, his voice low and rough, barely audible above the drumming of the rain on the roof. For the first time, she responded. Her hands slowly lowered from her ears. She didn't look at him, her eyes remaining fixed on the cold, dark stones of the hearth, on a future she couldn't see. "Sometimes it does," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread of sound. He saw the truth of it in the rigid line of her back, in the tension of her shoulders. He saw years of painful steps, of prayers whispered into the dust. A dark, cold anger stirred in his gut, an anger on her behalf. He thought of the men in town, with their easy judgments and their cruel whispers. He thought of whatever, or whoever, had put those scars on her feet and that terror in her soul. He opened his mouth to say something he wasn't sure what. Words of comfort were foreign on his tongue. Words of anger were a currency he preferred not to spend. The words he was good at were for horses and fences, for the simple, honest problems of the land. He swallowed the ones he wasn't good at, the lump of them hard and bitter in his throat. Instead, he stood up. He walked to the peg by the door and shrugged off his soaking coat. It was a heavy canvas thing, dark with rain. He hung it on the peg, where it immediately began to drip a steady rhythm onto the floor, forming a small puddle. Then he went back to his chair at the table and sat, a silent watchman. After a few minutes, Mara's shaking began to subside. She took a shuddering breath, then another. The thunder still roared outside, but its power over her was beginning to break. His presence, his solid, silent stillness, was a better shield than her hands had been. Slowly, unsteadily, she pushed herself up, using the mantelpiece for support. She saw his coat, dripping by the door. Without a word, she moved toward it. It was an act of housekeeping, a simple, necessary chore. But in the charged quiet of the room, it became something more. She took the heavy, wet coat from the peg. She carried it to the hearth and draped it carefully over the back of the other chair, angling it toward the fire she had yet to build. The gesture was intimate, a small truce disguised as domesticity. She was tending to his comfort, and he was allowing her to. The unspoken agreement hung in the air between them, as real as the smell of the rain. The roof rattled as a fierce gust of wind tore across it. From the barn, they could hear the gray mare stamp a nervous hoof against her stall door. The lantern he had left on the porch, forgotten in the sudden violence of the storm, sputtered in the wind, its flame dipping and threatening to die. Then it steadied, the small, determined light holding its own against the gale. Inside, they shared the quiet. The storm raged on, and the rain counted itself in a ceaseless, hypnotic drumming on the window panes. He sat at the table, his hands resting on his knees, watching the storm. She knelt at the hearth, her back to him, and began to lay a fire, her movements slow but deliberate. She stacked the kindling, placed the larger logs, her mind focused on the simple, constructive task. It was a way of fighting back, of creating a small circle of warmth and light to defy the chaos outside. The thunder still talked, a long, rolling conversation in the heavens, but she had stopped listening. And before the last of the thunder had grumbled its way east across the prairie, she had stopped shaking entirely. The fire caught, its small, hungry flames licking at the dry wood, casting a warm, dancing light across the room, pushing back the gray gloom. When it was finally over, a deep and profound quiet descended. The rain softened to a gentle whisper, and the world outside seemed to be taking its first clean breath. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, a scent of renewal. The fire crackled in the hearth, a sound of comfort and peace. Coulter stood up. The ordeal was over. He should go to his cot or check on the mare again, but he didn't. He walked to the threshold of the door, his hand resting on the wooden latch, and he lingered. He looked back into the room. It was transformed. The firelight cast warm shadows on the walls. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the clean smell of the rain. And in the center of it all was the quiet presence of the woman, now sitting on the floor, her back against the hearth, watching the flames. The house had always been a shell, a place to keep the wind out. The silence within its walls had always been one of emptiness. But this silence was different. It was occupied. It was shared. He lingered at the door like a man who had just come home and was surprised to find his house felt less empty than it had when he left. The morning after the storm was born clean and quiet. The air, washed of its dust, smelled of wet sage and damp earth, a scent of pure and simple grace. A fragile peace settled in the small house, a quiet born not of emptiness, but of shared space. Mara moved with a new, tentative purpose, her limp a little less pronounced, her shoulders a little less hunched against the expectation of a blow. They ate a breakfast of fried cornmeal mush in a silence that was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but comfortable, like a well-worn blanket. The outside world announced its return, not with a shout, but with a slow, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels. It was the first sign of life they'd had from the town since the storm. Mara was by the window, wiping it clean with a rag, when the wagon came into view on the main track, a good distance from the house but close enough to see clearly. Two women sat on the buckboard, their faces shaded by dark bonnets. As they drew parallel to the ranch, their heads turned in unison. Their conversation stopped. Their gazes swept over the small house, the mended fence, the curl of smoke rising from the chimney. They stared, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sharp, acquisitive judgment. Mara saw one of the women lean toward the other, her mouth forming words that were carried away by the breeze, but their shape was as clear as an insult. She instinctively stepped back from the window, pulling into the shadows of the room, a hot flush of shame creeping up her neck. The world was watching. By afternoon, the story had taken root in the dry, fertile soil of town gossip. The two women from the wagon, Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Gable, whose husband owned the mercantile, had delivered their eyewitness account along with their order for salt pork and molasses. The seed of the story that a woman was staying at Coulter Wade's ranch quickly sprouted into a more colorful and damning plant. It was no longer just a woman. It was a stray. The blacksmith's boy, a lanky youth of 16 named Jeb, was sent out on a fool's errand to deliver a single horseshoe that Coulter hadn't even ordered. The boy rode up, feigning nonchalance. His eyes darting toward the house, he pretended to adjust his saddle, lingering, hoping for a glimpse. He was rewarded with the sight of a silhouette moving behind the newly cleaned glass of the window, a woman's shape. It was all the confirmation the town needed. He rode back with his report, and the story grew another leaf Wade was keeping astray, and a lame one at that. The speculation bloomed, ugly and invasive, in the heat of the afternoon. Coulter heard it later that day. He'd ridden into town for coffee and a new axe handle, his business conducted with the same grim efficiency as always. He was at the mercantile, waiting for Mr. Gable to weigh out the coffee beans, when he heard two ranchers talking by the pickle barrel. "Heard Wade's finally found himself some company," one said, a wheezing chuckle in his voice. "Company," the other snorted. "More like charity. Gable's wife says she's that cursed widow that limped in yesterday. A real piece of broken crockery." That one. "Well, a man gets lonely," the first one mused. "Even a man like Wade. Guess he's not particular." Coulter's back was to them, but every muscle in it went rigid. Mr. Gable, behind the counter, suddenly found something fascinating to study on the ceiling, his face pale. Coulter set his tin cup, which Gable had just filled with coffee from the communal pot, down on the counter. He didn't say a word. He didn't turn around. He simply stood there, his stillness more menacing than any shout. And then, under the pressure of his grip, the metal of the cup handle groaned and buckled, the cup itself crumpled in his fist, a soft, final crunch of tortured tin. Hot black coffee leaked out from between his fingers, dripping onto the worn floorboards like a slow, dark temper. He left the ruined cup on the counter, paid for his goods without meeting Gable's eyes, and walked out. When he returned to the ranch, the storm was back in his face. It was a thunder he kept locked behind his teeth. He didn't tell Mara what he'd heard. He just put the supplies away, his movements clipped and angry. He saw her watching him, her eyes wide with a question she was too afraid to ask. The next morning, she made a decision. The sack of flour was almost empty, and she knew he wouldn't go back to town so soon. The idea of being the cause of his anger, the subject of the whispers she knew must be flying, was a fresh torment. She would not hide. She would not be a secret. "I can go," she said, her voice quiet but firm as he sharpened a knife by the door. "We need flour. I can walk it." He stopped, the whetstone falling silent. He looked at her, at the resolve in her face, and he seemed to have a war with himself. He wanted to forbid it, to keep her here where the world's ugliness couldn't touch her. But he saw in her eyes that this was not about flour. It was about dignity. To deny her this would be to agree with the town, to treat her as something broken that needed to be hidden away. "Trail's clear," was all he said, and went back to sharpening his knife. It was an act of immense courage for her to take the empty flour sack and the small wicker basket and start the long walk back toward redemption. Her crutches beat a steady, determined rhythm in the dust. The sun was warm on her back, and for the first mile, a fragile hope fluttered in her chest. She was not a beggar. She was a woman on an errand, a member of a household, a person with a purpose. The hope began to die as the first buildings of the town came into view. Her steps slowed. Her breath grew shallow. The town looked the same, but it felt different. It felt like an enemy territory she was willingly walking into. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the path ahead, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She made it to the mercantile. "Mr." Gable served her without a word, his eyes avoiding hers, his hands fumbling as he filled her sack. The transaction was heavy with everything left unsaid. She paid with the coins Coulter had left on the table, and turned to leave, the sack of flour now a heavy weight in her basket. The boardwalk was where it happened. As she hobbled toward the edge of town, two women emerged from the dressmaker's shop, blocking her path. It was Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Gable. They stood there, dressed in dark, respectable calico, their faces pinched with piety. They looked at Mara, their gaze traveling from her worn dress to her scarred feet to the splintered crutches under her arms. "Mrs. Prentice spoke first, her voice sweet as poison. Well, look, Eleanor, the stray's been let off its leash." Mrs. Gable's smile was a thin, cruel line. She looked at the heavy basket Mara was struggling to carry. "Mr. Wade is a charitable man," she said, her voice carrying so that the two men lounging in front of the saloon could hear. "But then, pity buys a certain kind of loyalty, doesn't it?" The word struck Mara with the physical force of a slap. Heat, fierce and suffocating, flooded her face. Shame, it was a living thing, a fire in her blood. Pity, loyalty. The words twisted Coulter's simple act of mercy into something transactional and sordid. They painted her as a conniving creature, trading on her own misery for a roof over her head. Her hands, slick with a sudden sweat, lost their grip. The wicker basket tilted, slipped. It fell to the boardwalk with a dry, hollow thud. The flour sack, not tied securely enough, burst open upon impact. Flour bloomed in the afternoon sun. A silent, white explosion. It billowed up in a soft cloud, coating the dirty, splintered wood in a pristine, ghostly white. It looked like a public loss, a stark and startling announcement of her failure and humiliation for all the town to see. A few men at the saloon laughed. Mrs. Prentice let out a small, triumphant titter. Mara just stared at the white dust settling on her broken life. The world narrowed to that white patch on the ground, a symbol of everything she had tried to build in the last 2 days, now spilled and spoiled in the dirt. She fled. She didn't stoop to rescue the basket or the empty sack. She just turned and hobbled away as fast as her body would allow, the crutches rattling on the boards like the frantic beat of her own terror. Her breath came in ragged, torn sobs, a sound like ripped cloth. She didn't stop when she reached the end of the boardwalk, plunging into the dusty road, her only thought to escape, to run from the laughter, from the stares, from the names that clung to her like burrs. She was halfway back to the ranch, her lungs burning, black spots dancing in her vision, when a figure on horseback materialized out of the heat haze ahead. It was Coulter. He must have been watching, or waiting. He rode not at a gallop but a steady, ground-eating trot, and he reached her in moments, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped. He stood in front of her, blocking her path, his face a thunderous mask. He took in her tear-streaked, dust-caked face, her heaving chest, the wild terror in her eyes. His gaze was sharp, searching for a physical injury. "Who hurt you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The question broke her. She shook her head, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. "No one," she choked out, the words raw and painful. "No one, just the names I've been carrying." His jaw muscle began to tick, a furious, silent rhythm. He hated this. He hated the things you couldn't fight, the wounds you couldn't see. He hated words that could bruise a person worse than a fist ever could. He understood then that the enemy wasn't a man he could face down, but a poison that had seeped into her soul long before he'd ever met her. She looked away from the anger in his face, her gaze falling to the dust. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I spilled the flour. I've made things worse for you. Maybe I'm just your burden after all." "You ain't," he bit out. The words were not gentle. They were not soothing. They were rough, immediate, and utterly absolute. They were spoken too quickly to be a lie, too forcefully to be mere pity. They were true. He said it like he was stating a fact of nature, like telling her the sun was hot or the ground was hard. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the prairie wrapping around them. Then, with a sigh that was more like the venting of a furnace, he reached out, took her by the elbow, his grip firm and steadying, and led her to his horse. He lifted her into the saddle as easily as he had lifted her from the street, then swung up behind her. He didn't speak again all the way back to the quiet solitude of the ranch. That night, a different kind of quiet fell. He sat on the porch step, cleaning his rifle, the metallic scrape and click a familiar, comforting sound. Inside, in the warm glow of the lamp, Mara sat by the fire. She had found his mending basket, a small, neglected thing with a few spools of thread and a rusty needle. She was mending a tear in the sleeve of one of his work shirts, her stitches small and neat. And as she worked, she began to hum. It was a low, tuneless sound, almost unconscious, the sound of a woman concentrating, a sound of a mind finally at peace enough to let a little music out. It wasn't a song of joy, but of simple, quiet contentment. Coulter stopped his work, his hands still on the rifle. He listened. The humming mingled with the soft crackle of the fire and the distant chirp of crickets. The silence in his house had always been a void, an absence of sound. But this was different. This was a quiet that was filled with a life, with a presence. It was the sound of a home. He tilted his head, listening to the soft, unfamiliar music from inside his house, and wondered when, exactly, quiet had started sounding so much like peace. The days after the incident in town settled into a new, fragile rhythm. A truce had been struck, not with words, but with shared labor and quiet proximity. The world shrank to the boundaries of Coulter Wade's property, a sun-bleached kingdom of dust and resilience. Here, within the fence line, the town's ugly whispers were a distant hum, a storm on a far horizon that had not yet reached them. They worked. Work was the language they both understood, a currency that required no sentiment. She took over the house, her movements growing more confident as she learned the geography of the small space. She scrubbed the floors until the pale wood shone. baked bread that filled the cabin with a scent of home it had likely never known, and mended his worn clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He, in turn, worked the land with a relentless energy, as if he could physically beat back the world's judgment with the sweat of his brow. He repaired the dry well's stone lining, reshod the gray mare, and continued his slow, methodical mending of the long fence line. It was the fence that brought it all undone. It was a hot, still afternoon, the air thick enough to drink. Coulter was resetting a post at the far corner of the property, the sledgehammer in his hands rising and falling with a grunt of effort. Mara had followed him out, unable to bear the confines of the house, bringing a canteen of cool water. She wanted to help, to do more than cook and clean. She wanted to feel the sun on her own back, to be a partner in this small act of holding the world at bay. "I can hold it steady," she had insisted, gesturing to the new post he was wrestling into the hole. He had looked at her bad leg, a refusal already forming on his lips. But then he saw the fierce, stubborn pride in her eyes, the same pride that had sent her into town for flour, and he gave a short, reluctant nod. For a while, it worked. She leaned her weight against the tall pine post, her hands flat against the rough, fragrant wood, keeping it perfectly upright while he tamped the earth around its base. There was a simple, satisfying rhythm to it, the scrape of his shovel, the thud of his boots kicking dirt into the hole, the shared focus on the single task. The sun beat down on them, and the only sounds were their labor and the buzz of insects in the dry grass. He was finishing, driving the last of the earth down hard. When she shifted her weight, it was a small, almost imperceptible adjustment, an attempt to ease the strain on her good leg. But the ground, softened by the recent rain and churned up by his digging, gave way beneath her. The heel of her boot sank into a soft patch of earth. Her bad leg, already trembling from the unaccustomed effort, simply refused to hold. There was no cry, only a sharp intake of breath. The world tilted sideways. Her hand slipped from the post, and she went down. Hard. It was a tangled, graceless collapse, a surrender of bone and muscle to the unyielding pull of the earth. She landed on her side with a jarring impact that knocked the wind from her lungs. Her crutches, which she had leaned against the nearby fence rail, were knocked over by her fall, and they skittered away into the dirt like frightened animals, leaving her stranded. For a moment, she just lay there, the smell of dust and crushed weeds filling her nostrils. Pain was a secondary concern. The first and most immediate sensation was a hot, familiar sting of humiliation. It was a deeper hurt than any bruised bone. In front of him, the one person who had treated her as something other than a broken object. She had fallen. "Mara." His voice was low, sharp with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "I'm fine," she gasped, the words catching in her throat, tasting of dust and pride. "I'm fine. I can get up." She tried to prove it. She pushed herself up onto her hands, her arms shaking. The world swam in a dizzying haze of heat and pain. She could feel the dirt grinding into her palms, the sharp protest of her hip and shoulder where she had landed. She tried to draw her good leg under her, to find some purchase, some leverage to rise, but her body was a traitor. Her muscles, strained and shocked, refused to obey. She was a tangle of useless limbs in the dirt. Her breath came in ragged sobs of effort and frustration. Pride and breath and the coarse prairie dirt were all tangled up inside her. She couldn't do it. He had been standing over her, a tall, still shadow against the blinding sun. He had watched her struggle, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw a line of granite. He had given her the dignity of letting her try. But now, seeing the fight go out of her, seeing her shoulders slump in defeat, he moved. He crouched beside her. His movements were a study in contained force, devoid of hurry or pity. He was simply addressing a problem. His shadow fell over her, a momentary relief from the oppressive sun. He said nothing. One arm, hard with muscle and corded with veins, slid beneath her shoulders, his palm splaying across her back. The other arm went under her knees, and then he lifted. It was the gentleness of the act that shattered her. There was no strain, no grunt of effort. He rose to his feet with a smooth, powerful grace, lifting her as if she were made of glass and not of flesh and bone, as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her against his chest, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. He smelled of sun, sweat, and clean earth. It was a tenderness so profound, so at odds with his hard reputation and his calloused hands, that it brought a hot rush of tears to her eyes. He was carrying the full weight of her pain, her pride, and her past, and he did not buckle. He carried her back to the house, his stride long and even. He nudged the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside, into the cool, dim quiet. He didn't set her on the cot. He lowered her carefully onto one of the chairs at the table, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second to make sure she was steady. The scrape of the chair legs on the clean wood floor was a harsh, ugly sound in the stillness. It was the sound of her own failure. The shame that had begun out in the dirt now bloomed fully in the safety of the house, stinging her eyes, tightening her throat. She stared down at her hands, now caked with dirt, and couldn't look at him. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, the words thick with unshed tears. It wasn't a protest. It was a lament. "You shouldn't have had to. You shouldn't have seen me like that." He didn't answer right away. He went to the dry sink, pumped some water into the basin, and brought it over with a clean rag. He knelt in front of her again, just as he had during the storm. He set the basin on the floor. His hands hovered near her bad knee, which was already beginning to swell, a dark purple bruise forming beneath the skin. His touch was a question, a request for permission he didn't voice. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He began to clean the scrapes on her shin with a focus that was absolute, his large hands surprisingly deft. "Ain't shame in needing help," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at her face, but at his work. "It is when all I am is help that's needed," she said, the bitterness a sharp taste in her mouth. "Strength is standing on your own 2 feet. I can't even do that." He stopped, the rag resting on her ankle. He finally looked up, and his gaze was steady, intense. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her as if she had just stated a profound falsehood, one that needed correcting. "No," he said, his voice flat and certain. "Strength ain't about never falling. Any fool can stand when the ground's firm. Strength it's keeping at it. It's getting up one more time than you'll fall down. It's standing when it hurts more than staying down." He glanced away, toward the window and the harsh, bright light outside, as if the words were being pulled from a memory. "It's about what you endure." His definition hung in the quiet room, simple, plain-spoken, and truer than anything she had ever been told. It reframed her entire existence. All the years of pain, of pushing through, of walking when every step was an agony. He was not seeing it as weakness. He was naming it as strength. Her gaze, full of a new and dawning wonder, drifted up from his hands to his face. It settled on the scar that bisected his eyebrow and the deeper one, the ragged pale crescent at his jaw. She had seen them before, of course, but she had seen them as just a part of the landscape of his hard face. Now, she saw them differently. She saw them as marks of endurance, proof of his own definition of strength. He must have felt her eyes on him, on the old wound. His jaw tightened. He looked away, his gaze dropping back to her knee, but his expression had changed. The memory, whatever it was clearly still fresh, still capable of causing pain. It was an unguarded moment, a brief glimpse into the history that had forged him, and it created a bond between them that was deeper than any touch. They were 2 scarred people, sitting in a quiet room who understood what it meant to endure. Later that afternoon, the heat settled in, thick and suffocating. He went outside to chop wood for the stove. The task was unnecessary. The wood box was already full, but she knew he needed the physical release, a way to work the tension from his shoulders. She stood at the window and watched him. He had stripped off his shirt, and his back and shoulders were a topography of lean, hard muscle that flexed and coiled with each swing of the axe. The afternoon sun slicked his skin with a sheen of sweat. He worked with a brutal, focused grace, the axe rising and falling, the clean, percussive crack of splitting wood echoing in the still air. She was watching not just a man doing a chore, but an exhibition of the very strength he had just described, controlled, powerful, and enduring. He stopped, leaning the axe against the chopping block, and reached for the canteen of water she had left on the porch rail. As he straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes met hers through the window. He caught her watching him. A jolt, hot and sharp as a spark from a flint, went through her. She should have looked away, pretended to be busy with some task. It was the proper, modest thing to do. But she didn't, and he didn't look away either. For one long, suspended moment, their glances held, stretching one heartbeat too long. Then two, it was a look that went beyond gratitude and respect, beyond the boundaries of protector and protected. It was a silent question and a silent answer, a mutual recognition of the man and woman they were beneath the scars and the hardships. Finally, her heart hammering, she broke the gaze, turning away from the window and picking up the broom. She began to sweep a floor that was already clean, her movements jerky and unsure. Outside, Coulter stood motionless for another long moment, the canteen forgotten in his hand, a slow, unfamiliar heat that had nothing to do with the sun spread through his chest. The fragile peace of their isolation was holding, but on the horizon, the gossip continued to twist itself into new and uglier shapes. It was no longer just about a stray. Now, the whispers in town painted her as a temptress, a woman of low character playing him for a fool. They called him a soft-hearted idiot, blinded by a pretty face and a limp. The town, it seemed, could smell the scent of hope wafting from his small ranch, and it was an odor they could not abide. They wanted it stopped. The intrusion came in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. The fragile peace of the ranch was so profound that the sound of approaching hoofbeats was a violation, a tearing of a delicate fabric. Mara was by the back door, tending to a small, struggling herb she had planted in a tin can, her fingers tracing a new green leaf. It was a small act of hope, of putting down a root, however shallow. When she heard the horses, she froze. It wasn't the sound of a single rider, like Coulter returning from a task. It was the lazy, confident clop of several horses, moving at a walk, as if they had every right to be there. She straightened up slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron, and moved to the edge of the window, peering out. 3 riders were pulling up by the water trough. For a heart-stopping moment, she didn't recognize them. They were just men, dusty and trail-worn like any others. Then the one in the middle swung down from his saddle, and the way he moved, a loose-limbed arrogance, a swagger in his walk, sent a spike of ice-cold dread through her. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his greasy hair, and when he turned his head, she saw the grin. It was a grin that didn't touch his eyes, a slash of white teeth in a sun-browned face that promised casual cruelty. A grin with fists, Pike Hurley. The other 2 men, shorter, broader figures she knew only as Jake and Sam, remained on their horses, their expressions sullen and watchful. They were followers, the kind of men who orbited a meaner, brighter star. The air in the small house suddenly felt thin and hard to breathe. The past, which she had so carefully tried to bury, had just ridden into the yard and was helping itself to a drink. Coulter was in the barn, oiling a harness. He would not have heard them yet. Pike cupped his hands and drank deeply from the trough, splashing water on his face. He looked around the tidy yard, his eyes lingering on the mended fence, the clean-swept porch, and the curl of smoke from the chimney. His gaze was proprietary, insolent, as if he were taking inventory of another man's goods. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He wasn't speaking to his men. He was speaking to the house, to the unseen audience he knew was within. "Looks like somebody landed on their feet. Free room and board. A cozy little house. A whole lot better than a leaky tent and cold rations. Ain't it?" He turned his head slightly, his grin widening, and his eyes found the window where she stood. He couldn't see her clearly through the glass and shadow, but he knew she was there. He raised his voice a notch. "Some gals got all the luck. Find a poor lonely fella and play on his sympathies." Then he used the name, a crude, ugly word that tasted like rust and shame, a name that stripped away her identity and left only her perceived use to a man. The word hung in the air, a physical thing, a deliberate defilement of the quiet sanctuary she had found. It was then that the barn door slid open with a low rumble. Coulter stepped out into the sunlight. He wasn't holding a weapon. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. He moved with a deliberate lack of haste, pulling the barn door closed behind him before turning to face the men. He looked from Pike to the two men on horseback, his expression flat, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. He didn't look toward the house. He already knew she was there, and he knew she had heard. He walked forward, stopping about 10 feet from the trough, placing his body squarely between Pike Hurley and the front door of the house. He became a wall. He was a physical barrier, a living shield against the poison that had just been spoken. Every line of his body said, "This far, and no further." Pike's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, wider and uglier than before. He was enjoying this. This was a story he could take back to the camp, a bit of spectacle to liven up a dull week. "Wade," he said, his tone a mix of mock respect and open challenge. "Just watering our horses. Long ride. I'm sure you ain't the kind of man to begrudge a fellow traveler a little water." Coulter's eyes didn't waver. His voice, when it came, was low, stripped of all emotion save for an absolute and final authority. "Drink and ride." It was not a suggestion. It was an eviction notice. The two words dismissed Pike's presence, his excuses, his entire being. They reduced him to a temporary nuisance whose time was up. The insult was in the brevity, the utter lack of engagement. Pike's face darkened. He had come here for a reaction, for a fight, for the satisfaction of proving that the woman in the house still belonged to the world he dominated. He was being denied his sport. He took a half step forward, away from the trough, puffing out his chest. "Now hold on," he said, trying to inject a note of wounded pride into his voice. "No need to be unfriendly. We're old acquaintances of the Lady of the House." He spat the title out, making it sound like another insult. He wanted a reaction. He was itching for the story, for the spectacle of a fistfight over a woman's honor. Coulter didn't move. He didn't tense. He didn't even seem to be breathing. Mara, watching from the window, her hands gripping the wooden rails so tightly her knuckles were white, felt her heart seize in her chest. She had seen this scene play out a dozen times in her life, and it always ended the same way, with noise and blood and the brutal satisfaction of violent men. She saw Pike's hand drift down, closer to the worn leather holster on his hip. But Coulter's thumb never touched the hammer of his own pistol. It rested on his belt buckle, a small, deliberate detail of profound restraint. In that moment, Mara saw him with a clarity that was almost painful. She was watching a man who could, with terrifying efficiency, break bones, a man who could end this confrontation in a storm of violence. And he was choosing not to. His stillness was a decision. His quiet was a show of force more intimidating than any drawn weapon. He was denying Pike the very thing he craved a justification for brutality. Pike, sensing he was losing control of the situation, played his last, cruelest card. He turned his venom from Coulter and aimed it directly at the window. at the woman he knew was watching. "You tell her," he sneered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, menacing tone, "that there's still the matter of old debts. Some folks don't forget what they're owed. You ask her what happens when a man's property goes missing." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And you ask her about all the folks who saw how she got that limp of hers. All the good, quiet witnesses who knew better than to step in." The words were hammer blows against Mara's fragile peace. The yard outside faded away, and she was back there, in the dirt and the darkness, the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies in her nostrils, the sound of laughter ringing in her ears as she fell. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The window rail was the only thing holding her up. He was right. There had been witnesses, and they had all stayed quiet. Coulter's jaw muscle began to tick, a furious, silent spasm. He had seen the slight tremble of the curtain at the window, and he knew Pike's words had found their mark. He had reached the end of his patience, but still, he would not give Pike the fight he wanted. He would not spill blood in his own yard. He took 2 deliberate steps forward, not toward Pike, but toward the trough. Pike instinctively took a step back, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He thought Coulter was going for him. Instead, Coulter drew back his leg and kicked the side of the wooden trough with the full, explosive force of his body. The sound was like a gunshot, a crack of splintering wood that echoed across the yard. The trough, old and weathered, shattered. The metal straps holding it together snapped, and 40 gallons of water exploded outward in a dirty, roiling wave, soaking Pike from the knees down and turning the dust around his feet to a thick, dark mud. The 2 men on horseback startled, their mounts shying away from the sudden noise and rush of water. Pike stood there, stunned, dripping and muddy, his bravado washed away in the deluge. Coulter looked at the ruined trough, then at Pike's shocked face. His voice was cold and dead as winter. "Water's done," he said. He raised his eyes to meet Pike's. "So are you." It was over. There was nothing left for Pike to say, nothing left for him to do. He had been dismissed, dismantled, and humiliated without a single punch being thrown. He wiped a hand across his wet trousers, shot Coulter a look of pure, venomous hatred, and turned without another word. He swung himself up into his saddle, his movements jerky and angry. The 3 men rode out, their horses kicking up mud and then dust. They muttered amongst themselves, but their words were lost to the wind. The yard, once their stage, was empty again. It kept their dust, their muddy footprints, and the wreckage of the trough, but it did not keep their laughter. That night, a deeper, more profound quiet fell on the small house. They ate their dinner of beans and cornbread in near total silence. The ghost of the afternoon's confrontation sat at the table with them. Mara kept seeing Pike's grinning face, kept hearing his words echo in her ears. After they had cleaned the plates, she retreated to the chair by the hearth, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Though the night was not cold, Coulter didn't go to his cot. He took his rifle down from the pegs on the wall. He checked the action, his movements efficient and sure in the lamplight. Then he pulled a chair over to the open doorway, sat down, and laid the rifle across his knees, its long, dark barrel pointing out into the night. Mara watched him, and she understood. The rifle was not for hunting. It was not a promise of aggression. It was a promise of vigilance. It was his way of saying that he would not sleep, that he would be the one to stand watch against the darkness, that the ghosts of her past would have to come through him to get to her. He was giving her his rest, offering up his own peace of mind for hers. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the rifle was for sleeping, not for him, but for her. The coyotes began to call from the distant hills, their lonely, yipping cries weaving through the vast, dark silence of the prairie. Outside, Coulter sat as still as a statue, listening for the sound of wagon wheels that did not come. And inside, Mara sat by the dying fire, her eyes wide open, listening right along with him. Neither of them slept. The night passed in a state of shared, silent vigilance, the rifle across his knees a dark promise against the vast, listening dark. Dawn arrived, not with a brilliant flash, but as a slow, quiet bleed of gray and lavender across the eastern sky. It brought with it the clean, sharp scent of wet sage, an aroma of wildness and solitude. The world felt scrubbed, but the air inside the small house was thick with the residue of yesterday's fear. Coulter was on the porch, his back to the open door, staring out at the horizon. The rifle was gone, put back in its place, but the tension remained in the rigid set of his shoulders. Mara watched him for a long moment from the threshold. He had not slept, had not rested. All for her. The weight of that sacrifice, coupled with the poison of Pike Hurley's words, had solidified into a hard, cold certainty in her gut. She was a blight, a magnet for trouble. She had brought the ugliness of her past to the one place she had found peace, and she had splattered it all over his quiet life. She stepped out onto the porch. The boards were cool and damp beneath her bare feet. He didn't turn, but she knew he was aware of her presence. The air between them was a taut wire. "I should move on," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. A small, flat stone dropped into the deep well of the morning's quiet. Today, he remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the brightening horizon. She could see the muscles in his back bunch beneath his shirt. He was coiling into himself, preparing for an impact. "I've brought you nothing but trouble," she continued, the words tasting like ash. "They'll keep coming. Men like that, they don't forget. I've put your name in the dirt right alongside mine. It ain't right. I need to go. To spare you. To spare myself any more of that." He finally moved. He bent down and picked up a small block of wood and a screwdriver. He walked over to the door and began to fuss with the bottom hinge, a hinge that had worked perfectly well just the day before. He was fixing something that wasn't broken, his hands needing a task to absorb the tremor of his thoughts. The scrape of the metal screwdriver against the screw head was the only sound. "Move on where?" he asked, his voice low and rough, his attention apparently focused entirely on the hinge. The question was a practical one, a dismissal of her entire emotional declaration. It was also a question she had been asking herself all night. She had no real answers, only a collection of desperate, faceless fantasies of disappearance. "Don't know," she admitted, her voice losing some of its steadiness. "Somewhere, a bigger town. Maybe there's always work for a woman who isn't proud. A laundry, maybe, behind a hotel, where no one has to look at your face. Or a kitchen, washing dishes. A kitchen just needs a pair of hands. Doesn't matter whose." She was describing a kind of living death, a self-erasure. She was listing all the nowhere places a woman like her was supposed to end up, the anonymous corners where the broken pieces of a life could be swept away and forgotten. The screwdriver paused. He rested his forehead against the doorframe for a moment, as if the weight of her words was too much to bear standing upright. He still wouldn't look at her. "I was only giving you a place to get well," he said, the words stiff, spoken to the wood and the iron of the hinge. "Room to heal, that's all." He meant it as a defense, an explanation. He was trying to tell her that he had not meant to trap her, that he had been trying to offer her a space with no expectations, no demands. He was a man who understood the value of being left alone, and he had thought that was the kindest gift he could offer. But she heard the words differently, in the bruised and battered vocabulary of her life. His words were a confirmation of her deepest fear. He had given her a room, a temporary space. He had been waiting for her to heal so that she could leave. He had just been a stop on the road, not the end of it. "Room," she repeated, the word a hollow echo in her chest. A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "Room is just another word for goodbye. Mr. Wade, a kinder word for it, is all." He flinched as if she had struck him. He pushed himself away from the door and turned, the screwdriver hanging uselessly from his hand. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were a raw mix of frustration and a deeper, more painful emotion she couldn't name. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to explain, but the right words were strangers to him. They hid in the silent, solitary country of his soul, and he did not know how to call them out. He snapped his mouth shut, his jaw tight with all the things he couldn't say. He turned and strode away from the house, toward the barn, leaving her alone with her decision, which now felt less like a choice and more like a sad, inevitable fact. She went back inside. The house was filled with the ghosts of the safety she had briefly known. The clean floor, the mended shirt folded on the chair, the smell of bread from the day before, they were all testaments to a life she was not allowed to have. She began to pack. It was a quiet, heartbreakingly simple task. She had arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and 2 splintered branches for crutches. Her life was a meager collection of borrowed and salvaged things. She took the thin shawl from the back of the chair, the one he had wrapped around her shoulders during the storm, and spread it out on the floor. It would be her satchel, her suitcase, the vessel for her entire world. She placed the mended shirt she had been working on back on the table. It was his, not hers. The apron she had worn, which she had washed and patched herself, she folded neatly and placed beside it. She looked at the small herb in the tin can. It would die without her. She left it on the windowsill. She gathered her own things. There was so little. The threadbare stockings she had washed and dried. A small, smooth stone she had picked up on the trail, its coolness a comfort in her hand. The worn dress she had arrived in, now washed and folded. That was it. That was the sum of her life. She folded the whole of it into the shawl, creating a small, sad bundle. She had made 2 quiet piles, what she was leaving, and what she was taking. One was a life of tentative hope. The other was the life she deserved. He had returned from the barn and was standing in the doorframe, watching her. His face was a mask, but she could feel the storm behind it. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. A silent, powerful impediment. He didn't speak. He just watched her tie the corners of the shawl together, his presence a heavy weight in the room. She could feel the anger and sorrow radiating from him, snarled up inside him like a tangle of barbed wire, each emotion making the other sharper, more painful. He was angry at her for giving up. He was angry at the world for making her feel she had to. And he was angry at the profound, frustrating inadequacy of his own silence. The day dragged on, a long, slow torture of unspoken farewells. The sun crawled across the sky. She cleaned the breakfast dishes, her movements slow and deliberate. He worked outside, his actions sharp and violent, chopping wood with a fury that split the logs in a single blow. Neither of them spoke. The silence was a conversation, a long and painful argument where both sides were losing. Evening came, bleeding bronze and gold across the western hills. The air grew cooler. It was time. There were no more chores to do, no more time to waste. She picked up her bundle. She found her crutches. She walked to the door where he still stood, an unmoving sentinel. She stopped in front of him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had to say something. She owed him that much. She looked up at his face, at the hard line of his jaw and the pain in his eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for the barn and the food. Thank you for letting me feel human again." The words, so simple and so honest, were a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Something in him broke. The rigid control he held over himself fractured. He stepped down from the porch, off the post he had been leaning against, and planted himself directly in her path. He was no longer a passive observer. He was an active force, a wall she would not be able to pass. "You ain't going nowhere," he said. The words were a low growl, a raw, ragged sound torn from deep inside him. Her breath hitched. She took a step back, her crutch slipping slightly in the dust. You don't get to decide, she said, a flicker of her old defiance returning. It was her life, her shame, her decision to make. Ain't deciding, he countered, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He took a step closer, crowding her, his sheer physical presence an argument in itself. I'm telling you what's true. The certainty in his voice was absolute. It wasn't the certainty of a master, but of a man who could see a truth so clearly it was like the sun in the sky. It shook her. It terrified her. It made a tiny, treacherous seed of hope begin to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. Why, she asked, and the single word was a crack in her own resolve. A plea. Her voice broke on the syllable, all the pain and confusion and desperate longing of the last few days pouring into that one sound. Why would you stop me? Why would you want me to stay? What could you possibly see in me but a burden and a source of trouble? He looked at her, and, for the first time, the mask was gone. His eyes were clear, and in their depths, she saw a raw and unguarded honesty that stunned her into silence. The barbed wire of anger and sorrow was still there, but it was wrapped around something else, something fierce and protective. Because, he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with a truth he had probably never spoken aloud in his life. Because when I look at you, I see the part of myself that didn't quit, the part that got knocked down and spit on and left for dead, and got back up anyway. He took a ragged breath. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Mara, and I ain't letting you walk away from here thinking you're weak. His words landed not in her ears, but in the hollow space in her chest where hope had long since died. They were not soft words, not pretty words, but they were solid. They were like stones being laid for a foundation, heavy and true. She stared at him, at the raw honesty in his eyes, and felt the carefully constructed walls of her resignation begin to crumble. He was not seeing the broken widow, the cursed beggar, the town's stray. He was seeing a strength in her that she had never dared to name herself, a resilience she had only ever considered to be a grim and joyless necessity for survival. The tears that had threatened earlier now came, but they were not the hot tears of shame or the cold tears of despair. They were tears of a profound and painful unburdening, as if some great weight was finally being lifted from her soul. She shook her head, a small, futile gesture of denial against a truth that was too large to accept all at once. The world will not see it that way, she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. She was thinking of the women on the boardwalk, of Pike Hurley's sneer, of the whispers that would follow them like shadows for the rest of their days. They will laugh at you. They will call you a fool and me. They will call me worse. They will twist this into something ugly. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance. He looked past her, toward the distant, unseen town, his face hard as flint. Let it, he said, the two words a dismissal of the entire world and its opinions. He brought his gaze back to her, and it was fierce, protective. The world ain't the one that carried you out of the dirt. The world ain't the one that sat with you through the storm. Its words are just wind. They don't have no weight here. He was drawing a line, not in the dust, but in the very fabric of their reality. On one side was the town, with its noise and its judgment. On the other was this small patch of land, this porch, this circle of two. And in his world, only what happened inside that circle had any meaning. But her fear was an old and deeply rooted thing. It had learned to send out tendrils into the future, to anticipate every possible failure. And if I fall again, she asked, the question small and fragile. A child's fear voiced in the encroaching twilight. It wasn't just about her leg. It was about her spirit, about her ability to keep going. What if she failed him? What if she became the burden she so dreaded? He didn't hesitate. There was no flicker of doubt in his eyes, no calculation. His answer was as swift and sure as a striking hawk. Then I'm there before you hit the ground. It was not a boast. It was a vow. A plain-spoken, ironclad promise that held no room for argument. It was a statement of a new law of physics that would govern their world if she fell. He would be there to catch her. The simplicity of it, the absolute certainty, silenced the frantic chorus of doubts in her mind. As if summoned by the intensity of the moment, a gust of wind swept up from the prairie, cool and sudden. It lifted the hem of her dress and stirred the loose strands of her hair. It carried the clean, sharp smell of rain-soaked earth, the scent of a world washed clean. The sudden force of it made her stumble. Her crutch, resting on the uneven ground, slipped on a loose stone. For a sickening half-second, the world tilted, and she felt the familiar, terrifying sensation of falling. But she did not fall. His hand was at her waist. He had moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, his body closing the distance between them in a single, fluid motion. His hand was large and warm, and it did not grab or clutch. It settled on the curve of her waist with a firmness that was all support, all steadiness. His touch was careful. It was reverent. It was the touch of a man holding something precious and breakable, and it sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was a touch that acknowledged all her fragility and, in the same moment, made her feel utterly, unshakably safe. She looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. They were standing so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes, the deep lines etched at their corners by sun and sorrow. The space between them had vanished, and the whole world had shrunk to this single, breathless point of contact. "You're not my burden, Mara," he said, and his voice was different. It was thin, stretched taut with the weight of years of unspoken loneliness, of a lifetime of holding everything inside. He said her name, and the sound of it on his lips was both a shock and a homecoming. "You were never my burden." He took a ragged breath, the confession of his life finally breaking free. "You're my reason." The words were a quiet cataclysm. They struck her with more force than any clap of thunder. A reason. He was a man who had existed on pure, stubborn will, a man who had survived by needing nothing and no one. And he was telling her that she had given him a purpose beyond the simple, grinding mechanics of survival. She had become the why. She began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that started in her core and spread to her fingertips. The porch, the fading light, the vast prairie, it all dissolved into a blur. There was only the solid presence of him, his hand at her waist, the single anchor in her spinning universe. The air between them was alive, charged with everything he had just said, everything she was feeling. The porch had become a wide, silent confessional. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, the words a surrender, an admission of her own profound confusion. She had no map for this territory. The landscape of her life had been one of fear and endurance. She did not know the language of mercy, of being seen, of being a reason. He looked down at her, and a flicker of something that was almost a smile, a gentle, sad softening, touched his hard mouth. "It's peace," he said, his voice a low rumble. "If you let it be. Peace. Not happiness, not love, not any of the grand, breakable promises people made to one another. Just peace. An end to the running, an end to the fighting." It was the most beautiful word she had ever heard, and he was offering it to her as a choice. If you let it be. Her last line of defense, the old, ingrained habit of earning her keep, rose up one final time. She had to make this make sense. She had to put it back into a framework she understood. "I can stay," she bargained, her voice still trembling. "I'll stay as your worker. I'll earn my place. You don't have to pay me wages, just let me work. For my room, for my board." She was trying to build a wall of practicality around the raw, terrifying emotion between them, to disguise this monumental gift as a simple transaction. He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. His hand at her waist tightened its gentle, steadying grip. "It ain't about the work anymore," he said, his voice firm, refusing her the comfort of that disguise. He would not let her hide. He would not let her diminish what this was. He was forcing her to face the truth of it, head on. And, in his gaze, she saw that the choice was real. She could pick up her bundle and walk away, back into the familiar misery of her old life. Or she could stay. She could accept this impossible, terrifying gift of peace. She could let it be. She took a breath. It was the first breath she had taken in months, perhaps in years. That was not laced with fear. It was a deep, shuddering intake of the cool, sage-scented air. And as she let it out, it felt as if she were unspooling a lifetime of running, of hiding, of being afraid. "Then I'll stay," she said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a felled tree. They were a choice, her choice, an act of profound and terrifying courage. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and a long, slow breath hissed out of him. It was the sound of a gate, rusted from long disuse, finally swinging true and easy on its hinges. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a very, very long time. He released her waist, his hand falling away, though the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. He stepped back, giving her space, the intensity of the moment finally receding into a quiet, settled reality. He gestured with his head toward the open door. "It's getting cold." She nodded, unable to speak. She bent down and picked up the small, sad bundle of her belongings from the porch floor. She walked back into the house. No longer a guest, no longer a stray. She walked back into a place that was, impossibly, becoming a home. He followed her in, closing the door on the night and the world. He moved to the stove, where the coffee pot still sat from the morning. He stoked the embers of the fire, added a few small pieces of wood, and set about making them both a cup. Inside, the lamplight created a small, warm circle of gold. 2 tin cups, scoured clean, sat side by side on the scarred table, waiting to be filled. Soon, they would be steaming. 2 small pillars of warmth in the quiet house. Outside, the bronze and gold had deepened to a bruised and majestic purple. The clouds that had been building in the west all day had thickened, holding the promise of a storm, but the air was still. The thunder was silent. It was as if the sky itself was holding its breath, holding back its own wild power, saving its rain like a blessing it had decided they had earned. At least for tonight. The word stay was not a cage door locking, but a garden gate swinging open. It did not create a home overnight, but it allowed for the possibility of one to be planted. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch, a quiet that was not born of solitude or unspoken tension, but of a deep and settled peace. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a shared gravity that had not been there before. The space between them was no longer a gulf of uncertainty, but a comfortable, charged silence filled with the promises he had made and the choice she had embraced. But a secret, even a quiet one, cannot survive for long on the open prairie. The wind has too many voices. Word spreads, not in a direct line, but in a slow, circular eddy, like smoke. The blacksmith's boy, Jeb, riding out to check a distant fence line, saw them. He saw Coulter mending a roof shingle while Mara sat on the porch step below, shelling peas into a bowl in her lap. He saw the way Coulter paused to watch her, the way she looked up and smiled, a small, tired smile that transformed her face. It was a scene of such simple, shocking domesticity that it was more potent than any rumor. He carried the image back to town like a lit torch. And so, a week later, the preacher came. He was a tall, stooped man named Reverend Miller, with a face as kind and sorrowful as his profession demanded. He rode a sway-backed mule and carried his hat in his hand as he approached the house, a gesture of both respect and timid intrusion. Coulter saw him coming from a long way off and met him in the yard, his stance neutral but unyielding. Mara watched from the window, her hands suddenly still in a bowl of dough. The arrival of the man of God felt like the arrival of the town's conscience, a formal inquiry into the state of their souls. "Mr. Wade," the preacher began, his voice soft, almost apologetic. He looked from Coulter's hard face to the small, neat house, and his gaze was not unkind. "I am not here to cast judgment. The Lord knows this is a hard country, and the arrangements folks make to survive are their own. But the town talks, and when a good woman is living under a man's roof," he trailed off, letting the sentence hang in the air, heavy with unspoken scripture and social law. He cleared his throat. "If she is to remain under your roof, sir, for her sake and for yours, you must make it right." The demand was gentle, but it was a demand nonetheless. It was the outside world, bringing its rules and its ceremonies to their quiet, unceremonious life. That evening, the lamplight in the cabin seemed warmer, softer, a fragile shield against the encroaching dark. Coulter was quiet, more so than usual, the preacher's words having settled deep inside him. Mara moved about the room, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She feared she had brought a final, impossible complication to his life. She was folding one of his clean shirts, a simple blue cotton one she had washed and mended that afternoon. The fabric was warm from being near the fire, and it smelled of soap and sunshine. Coulter sat at the table, watching her. He watched her hands, worn and capable, as they moved with a careful grace, smoothing the collar, folding the sleeves. He watched the way the lamplight caught the gold in her hair, in the gentle, rhythmic motion of her hands, in the quiet peace of her presence. He saw the entirety of the life that had begun to take root in his empty house. The preacher's words echoed in his mind, "Make it right." He looked at her, standing there in the warm light, folding his shirt, and a truth rose up in him, as clear and powerful as a prairie sunrise. He finally understood what right meant. It wasn't about the town, or the preacher, or the rules. "Mara," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. She looked up, her hands stilling on the shirt. "The preacher came today," he stated, his eyes holding hers. He saw the flicker of fear in them, and he wanted to extinguish it forever. "He said I had to make it right." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle between them. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his life on splintered crutches and had somehow become the steady center of his world. "There ain't nothing in this whole world," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was years in the making, "that I want more right than you." The shirt slid from her fingers, forgotten, landing in a soft pile on the table. Her hands trembled. Her mind, so accustomed to the harsh language of survival, struggled to translate this new and beautiful vocabulary. He was not talking about a roof or a name. He was talking about her worth, about her place, not just in his house, but in his life. The sheer, staggering weight of his sincerity was too much to bear. "I don't deserve that," she whispered, the old, familiar refrain of her own unworthiness rising up like a ghost. "I have nothing. I am nothing. Just a woman with a past that won't let go." He stood up then and walked around the table until he was standing in front of her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a warmth that enveloped her. He looked down at her, and his face was etched with a profound and weary wisdom. "Maybe neither do I," he said, his voice quiet. And in those 4 words, he gave her the greatest gift he possessed. It was the frontier's hard-won grace, the understanding that mercy is not a wage to be earned, that belonging is not a prize to be won. It is a shelter that some people, against all odds, find their way to, and the only requirement is to be brave enough to accept it when it's offered. He was not a saint offering salvation to a sinner. He was just a man, scarred and solitary, recognizing the strength in a scarred and solitary woman. He was putting them on the same ground, making them equals in their shared, undeserving humanity. The preacher returned at dusk 2 days later. He did not come into the house. They met him on the porch as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. He held a small, worn Bible in his hands. Coulter had given him $2 silver that morning, and now the preacher laid 2 simple bands on the porch rail. They weren't gold or silver. They were iron, hammered into imperfect circles, dull and strong. They were perfect. There were no speeches. There was no congregation, save for the patient, watchful prairie. The ceremony was sized to the land itself, vast, quiet, and deeply serious. The preacher read a short verse from his worn Bible, his voice a low murmur against the rising wind. And then he asked for their vows. Their vows were not the flowery, rehearsed promises of another world. They were built from the materials of the life they had already forged together. They were vows built from work and weather and watching over. In the quiet language that had grown between them, they made their promises. A promise to be the one who mended the fence. A promise to be the one who stood with a lantern in the storm. A promise to be there before the other one hit the ground. A promise to see the strength, even when the world saw only the weakness. Outside, the clouds that had been threatening for days had thickened. A heavy, dark blanket pulled across the sky, but they refused to rain. It was as if the heavens were holding their breath, respecting the sanctity of the small, quiet ceremony taking place below. Inside, after the preacher had mounted his mule and ridden off into the twilight, they stood in the warm lamplight of the cabin. A new and profound quiet settled between them. She looked at the iron band on her finger. It was cool and solid. He looked at her, and in the quiet, they traded the word home like a secret that was finally safe to say. He walked over to the corner where her crutches leaned against the wall. He picked them up, the splintered wood familiar in his hands. He looked at them, at the symbols of her old life, of her pain and her wandering. Then he looked at her, standing by the fire, her weight resting on her good leg. He walked over and set the crutches by the wall, out of the way, but not hidden. They were a part of her story, but they were not the whole story. Mara didn't need them in this moment. She stood with a quiet, certain limp, a physical reminder of the journey that had brought her here. But the limp no longer owned her. It was simply a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the strength in her hands. Morning laid a clean, golden light on the porch. 2 pairs of boots rested side by side near the door, his large and mud-scuffed, hers smaller and worn thin. They were scuffed and honest, and they belonged together. Later, they rode into town. It was a silent declaration, a refusal to hide. They needed supplies, but it was more than that. It was a test. As they rode down the main street, some eyes averted. The townsfolk suddenly finding the dust at their feet fascinating. Others lingered, their faces a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. The whispers had not died, but they had lost their power. They saw a man and a woman who had, against all odds, made their own law, their own world, and neither of them bent to the wind of the town's opinion. Back at the ranch, life settled. The small house kept breathing, its rhythms now the rhythms of 2 hearts instead of one. The fence, mended and strong, held the line against the vast, empty prairie, and on the porch rail, where he had set it that first night, the lantern was still there. It was unnecessary now, its light pale against the bright. Shared days and the peaceful, protected nights. But every evening, as dusk fell, he lit it anyway. It burned through the night, a small, steady flame, a quiet testament to a mercy that had become a home, a reason that had become a life. It burned, a stubborn and beautiful light. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting that hype button. Your support means the world to us.